Hey, everybody. Welcome to Social Impact Documentary Filmmaking here at the Bend Film Festival. I'm honored to be hosting this. I'm David Holbrook. I'm the founder and ringleader of an ideas festival called Original Thinkers in Telluride, where I live. And I also was at the helm of Telluride Mountain Film for a decade, and worked at EarthX. And I just realized I pulled off my 20th film festival recently. I'm also a filmmaker. I've done a couple of films along the way, including one about my father called The Diplomat, features, shorts, a bunch of different stuff. But this is much more interesting to talk about. The guests we have here joining today, who I'm really excited, two of whom I know. One is Christy Cooper, who directed a terrific feature doc called Youth v. Gov, as well as a short that spun out of that called We Have Reached the Moment, that we had the honor of playing at Original Thinkers recently. And such a pleasure to see you again, Christy.
Good to be here.
Oh, what a pleasure. Sky Fitzgerald, who did Hunger Ward, Lifeboat, 50 Feet from Syria, a trilogy that I think is not unrivaled because we're not rivals, but there's nothing to really compare it to. You know, there's nothing that I've seen. There was a filmmaker who went after this kind of work in such a way. And then Christina Antonakis Wallace, who we have not met, but I saw your wonderful film called From Here, which is a look at immigration, not just in the States, but globally. And thank you to Bend Film Festival for having us, for doing this panel. And hell, let's get into it, huh? It's a complicated thing. This is called social impact documentary filmmaking, which could be in parentheses that we don't make money, but we're not going to focus on that. We're not going to focus on that because it's such an interesting thing, because we do make these films for reasons. And knowing Sky and Christy, we're motivated by a worldview, by a mission, all these other things, but it needs to have an impact. Otherwise, we're just kind of laying an egg. And so I want to explore with each of you how these ambitious films you made, these filmmakers, folks, are not people who screw around. And Christy, I'm going to start with you, just because I know that trajectory of this film. Tell us, Youth v. Gov, everybody, is the story of 21 youth. They were kids, now they're young people, who sued the American government over an inaction on climate change. It's a beautiful film. It's winning awards right and left, including the Jackson Hole Wildlife. Congratulations on that. Christy, when you set out on this journey, how many years ago?
5.5 years ago.
I went by like that. 5.5 years ago, did you say, okay, I'm making this film because I want to have an impact? Why did you make this, set out on that journey?
Yeah, I knew from the beginning, I had worked with some of these young people 10 years ago on a series of 10 short films, and they were also kids who were suing their state governments over climate inaction at the time. And I learned a lot through that process of the power of the youth voice and how much decision makers really listen to kids and how important their voice is for them to have a seat at the table. So when I started out on this film, I knew that climate change is really, our probably the most urgent human rights issue of our generation. That's affecting the entire world. I knew that this legal case had the potential to go somewhere and to really make a difference. And I set out from the beginning knowing that I wanted to have an impact campaign associated with the film. And, I felt like the work that these kids were doing in the courtroom, it needed to have a voice in the public space as well, so that folks could understand the importance of our judicial system, the importance of all three branches of government working towards climate solutions, and what our role is as citizens in our democracy in keeping that functioning.
And Christina, talk a little bit about your film From Here, which really it's looking at immigration here in the States, Germany, all these different countries where it's really complicated, with a wonderful array of characters with their own story and their own angle. Did you say, okay, wait, and let's not talk about the impact campaign. Let's talk about the impact that you wanted to have on our understanding of an audience on this particular story?
Yeah, thanks for that question, David. I think there's a couple layers of impact that I was interested in, and the thing that I think is maybe often overlooked in a project like mine is that I'm not just trying to change hearts and minds. I wasn't with From Here. I was actually offering the film hopefully as a source of resonance and healing for people whose lives were directly impacted by migration, who weren't seeing their stories told in a way that was respectful and whole. And so, you know, young people in the US, in Europe, and all over the world, many come from immigrant communities. The film is about people in their 20s. You look at the demographics, not just in urban areas, also in rural areas now. You have a large percentage, sometimes the majority of young people who are immigrants themselves or children of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants directly impacted. And yet the representations of immigrants are so often as criminals, as, you know, really racialized depictions. So I was looking to make a story that also represented young people and a slightly older demographic, but people in their 20s who were sort of coming of age, offering a vision of sort of global citizenship for the rest of the world to learn that there's sort of perspective and point of view around these issues that can come from people who've been directly impacted by them. It can come from creative young people who are finding really interesting solutions for how to craft a life in a world that's told you you don't belong anywhere. So that was my first audience. It wasn't actually to change legislation, because I think although that is needed, absolutely, the political change is needed. We have to actually build the power of like grassroots communities to know that their voices matter in these issues, and that young people are on the front lines of making these changes all over the world. And so building up that power and putting out that story on this topic was what I was interested in as my primary impact. Yeah.
Sky, speak to a little bit of the trilogy that I mentioned earlier, and what impact you, because I think, you know, certainly 50 Feet from Syria and Lifeboat have, you know, we're back a few years, Hunger Ward a little more recently, but what impact have you seen the films have? And that can be micro or macro. Let's start with the micro. You know, the doctor in 50 Feet from Syria, did making that film have an impact on his work?
Well, it's an interesting example to bring up, David, because when we screened 50 Feet from Syria at Mountain Film, which you programmed, by the way, thank you very much. You were the first festival to say yes, thumbs up. So my eternal gratitude to you for that. But, you know, when we went back later and screened Lifeboat at the same festival at Mountain Film, David, we had a number of experiences that speak to the micro impact of the film. And I think sort of the passing it forward aspect that I think all of our work has sometimes, which is hard to measure, but very real. So we finished a screening of Lifeboat at Mountain Film. And afterward, you know, I mentioned during the course of the Q&A that, you know, it was part of a trilogy. It was the second film of the trilogy. And afterwards, there was a gentleman in the theater who approached me right after the Q&A and he said, Sky, what was the first film of the trilogy? And I told him 50 Feet from Syria. And he sat there for a second, just completely neutral. And he says, I have to tell you, I'm a doctor. I saw 50 Feet from Syria at Mountain Film. And Hisham Bismar, the doctor in that film, inspired me so much that I'm now volunteering with SAMS as a doctor in Jordan, right? And you know, those are the moments I live for, right? You know, we can measure metrics and we can raise money, but when something I do moves someone else to action, to tangible commitment and action, that's meaningful to me as a filmmaker. And those are the moments that stick with me. And you know, I'm sure each of us have stories like that we can share. Certainly those are the ones that make me feel like at least those moments on this planet that I spent making that film were absolutely worthwhile.
It's such a big question too, the worthwhile part of it. And we'll get into some more tangible things about measurement, but like, God damn, I love an anecdote and I love a connection. I love this sense of, you know, I mentioned earlier, I made this film about my father called The Diplomat, who was a diplomat named Richard Holbrooke, who was gone a lot because that's what he did. And I remember getting a note from a guy I went to high school with who said, David, I watched your film and it moved me. And he grew up in DC like I did. And he said, my father was always gone. And watching your film helps me process that a little bit better, helps me understand. I was like, okay, that doesn't make the situation in Afghanistan any better. There are these strange little things that happen that I think that I just love. But of course, you know, we don't make them for our own sense of and that little bit of gratification, this little bit of healing that this gentleman went through, as opposed to your doctor saying, wait, I'm going to go there, are much bigger. Christy, for you with the film Youth v. Gov, you got 21 plaintiffs. And like you said, you're taking on what is, you know, some would say the ultimate issue, some would say the mother of all issues, some would say the only issue that really matters because it influences the rest of our work, which is climate. 5.5 years later, the suit goes on, but the climate keeps on accelerating. So how do you measure your own impact in something that's just so literally globally, if not galactically massive?
Yeah, it's overwhelming.
No pressure, by the way.
Yeah, it's an overwhelming topic to be working in, and you know, as you said, it's so intersectional. I mean, it does in fact, affect food security and migration and economics, and you know, there's so many racial disparities and so many issues that it intersects with that it sometimes feels incredibly overwhelming. But I think in working with these young people, I've just really learned that the work that needs to be done is this outreach and is this public awareness. And I think I've been really inspired the last 5 years to really see how young people are taking these issues on and are, you know, they're in the streets, they're in the courtrooms, they're in our leaders' offices, and they're really taking people to task on these really important issues. And that keeps me going, and that keeps, you know, me motivated, despite how slow it seems that the wheels of justice turn and how slow our country's leaders are in addressing this urgent crisis. We just have to keep hoping that the greater awareness that we can build and the more young people that we can get out there fighting for their rights, I think, you know, that's really the hope that we have.
Christina, you paralleled that a little with your earlier answer about young people and being on the forefront of understanding this. And I think it's so true, but I'd like to pose pretty much the same or similar question to you. Is immigration's massive. What a giant subject. Do you hope that from here will change, you know, thinking, policy, all these things, or is it and this is all good, by the way, is it a motivator that we're like, oh yeah, we got to keep on thinking about this and we got to focus on this and we got to fight for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think immigration is one of those things that unless you are directly impacted, often you ignore. I think, unfortunately, many, especially people who are citizens, especially white Americans, don't necessarily consider it a very important issue. But if you really care about any progressive issue in this country, immigration has been used as the primary wedge to accelerate the far right in this country. It's been galvanized by the far right all over the world, and certainly in Europe. And so that's how these struggles are all connected. We can't be working on one front. We have to be working on all these fronts at the same time and drawing the intersections between them, and not thinking that, oh my God, we only all have to be working on this thing or that thing that seems to be the one, because actually they're all totally interdependent. Unfortunately, we had the worst anti-environment president who was brought in on an anti-immigrant platform, right? And so what he did about the environment maybe didn't even get talked about if you weren't in the environmental circles. So it's just to say that, yes, this is about immigration. This is about, again, one of the biggest human rights issues of our time. And it's also about everything, because if we care about human rights, if we care about really the survival of life on this planet, We have to look at those who are most vulnerable, and the people who are forced to flee their country, which I think relates also to Sky's work, people who are forced to leave because of economic displacement, climate displacement, also arrive to places where they're denied their basic rights to vote, to participate, to survive and flourish. And that's an issue for all of us. So yes, I think that my hope is not just to talk about the crisis though, but also to talk about the opportunity. If we really want to embrace our interdependence as a species, as a planet, then looking at migration as one of those ways that, we know that animals migrate. We know that humans have always migrated, but yet we've put up these national borders and we think that they're real and we think we can defend them forever. So hopefully by introducing things that kind of problematize that question, that and offer visions of something that is beyond that, is planting the seeds for the future that we really want. In addition, in the film, we see people who are fighting for their rights. So we know there are political struggles going on, but one piece of legislation is not going to fix this issue. This is something that is going to be with us until we really reimagine how we give people rights in the world right now, and not only give it based on where you are a citizen or not. And if you don't have citizenship at all, which many people in the world don't have citizenship anywhere. So I hope that it's both a push to care about the issues in your own country right now, whether you're somebody in Europe or somebody in the US, but also to question national borders as a construct, as the way we validate life on this planet right now for humans. And something that can be connected to all these other struggles that we're talking about today.
Yeah, and the struggles, it's a great way to put it, and I think about your film, Sky, of the struggles that are hard for us to understand, and you take us there and you say, okay, this is what it looks like 50 feet from Syria. This is what it is in a hunger ward. And of course, we have the remove of our screens and our distance. For you on a policy level, and as a sort of follow-up to I asked you earlier about the micro level, and I love the story about the doctor and a good anecdote, but let's talk policy. And I remember you were taking one of the films, I'm sorry, I don't remember which, to Congress. You were doing these things. Did you see that manifest in any real change of what was happening out there from a governmental standpoint?
Yeah, because I'm such a firm believer in, what we do, at least this genre of documentary film, as being cinema being an interventionist tool, right, for social change. I mean, that's really what we're all doing here on some level, right? And that's something I'm so deeply committed to, that we set out really concrete goals before creating the film for what we want that intervention to look like. In the case of Hunger Ward, in tandem with my producer, Mike Schuerman, he created this fantastic overview document based upon the principles that we had talked about before we even did the film, that, basically I'm looking at it right now. The problem, worst humanitarian crisis in the world, right? Strategic objectives, end war and famine through the War Powers Act or War Crimes Act, right? Raise funds for the Yemeni NGOs that we're working with to directly support these healthcare workers that are saving children on a daily basis, right? And then build out our human rights network to intervene legislatively at the state level as well. And then from that flows out how that's going to look like, right? So, probably the biggest goal, the thing that we have hoped for and worked for so long in this project, in tandem with the 70 some different civil society allies that we're part of this alliance with, is to actually end US intervention in Yemen. Full stop, right? Unilaterally in support for the coalition. We have not achieved that. We're still working on it. Our allies are still working on it. And we're still hopeful by the end of the Biden administration that the US will unilaterally withdraw support, and that our tax dollars will stop funding this horrific conflict, right? Now, Biden did, you may recall, immediately after taking office, in his first public statement, basically said that we would stop supporting all offensive operations in Yemen. But he's done very little since then. The second objective, to raise funds for these healthcare institutions which are crumbling in Yemen to directly meet children. We thought we might raise $5,000 or $10,000 to directly support food, and we've raised $235,000.
Damn.
Yeah. And so, you just don't know, right, when you set out to do something like this. But if you're committed, and what I've learned is if my goals are clear and we have the right allies, we can achieve a lot. And we're continuing down that path until all of these met. So I call it the long tail of documentary film, right? You have to be sort of prepared to like hang on and stick with it, right? Long after the film's done, right? Because to me, this is as vital and as important as the cinema itself, right? It's making change with the cinema.
Yeah, it was such a wake up call when I came from TV producing and worked with Today Show and CNN, those kind of places, where you made something, you handed it to somebody, a tape that you handed to somebody who put it in a machine, and that beamed out to the audience and was pretty easy. I mean, not the work was similar to the storytelling, but it was hard. It was the getting it out there part was hard. And I think so much of our work, first of all, you're like, yeah, I finished the film. You're like, wait, why did they just put the finish line 26 miles away? What the hell? Nobody told me that. And not only that, like, you don't really know where to run. And you're like, okay, I'm gonna figure out. And films like yours and a lot of films are dependent on a festival ecosystem, which is great. But how? What advice do you have people who are out there saying, okay, you thought you made it to the finish line of finishing your film, but in fact, you're just starting it, to play off what you said, Sky, and Sky, but why, if you could just, since you've made these other films, start with that. And then I'd like to hear from Christina as well.
Another story quickly. Sorry. Forgive me.
I love an anecdote.
And I've told this before, but I was at a Sundance Institute workshop over 10 years ago, and they had some fantastic speaker in whose name I don't recall. But whoever you are, thank you very much. They were a great speaker, and they said something in that workshop that really stuck with me. And what they did is they drew a triangle on the board, right? And it was a workshop about a career in documentary film, essentially. And they said, listen, here's the triangle, right? And then on one side they wrote money, another side they wrote fame, and the bottom they wrote change. And they let it sit there on the board for a second, and then they said, choose two. You can only have two.
That's easy. Right? Fame and fame.
That's right, exactly.
I mean, that seems so
it might
obvious.
be interesting for us to talk about that, right? And so I'm certainly not a millionaire at this point, and it hasn't been my goal to. But change is what I'm after, right? Change. That's why I'm a documentary filmmaker. In part, is to try to intervene in the real world, and that's really important to me. And that's why any project I take on personally, it has to pass what I call the so what test, which is just a very personal litmus test of, is this topic important enough that if I don't do it, people in the world are going to suffer more? In other words, can I intervene in a positive way in another human being's life by making this film? And the answer is yes. Then I feel like that's a good use of my time on this planet.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Will you follow up with that, Christy or Christina?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sky. I got my MFA in film, and my thesis was focused on advocacy and campaign storytelling, and this was really what I wanted to do with stories. And yeah, I just I'm not exactly sure where you want me to go with this.
No, I just think it's so interesting. Let me just shift a little bit, which is related. Is we're storytellers. Mm. We're not policy people. Yet, hearing Sky talk about the specifics of Syria, or your deep understanding, and you see in the film, Christy, of climate and the history of it. And Christina, for you, I would consider you an expert on the subject of immigration, but yet we're storytellers. How do you straddle that line of saying, wait, I'm going to be tell a story that matters, but also engage in policy? Christina, how do you plug into that specifically?
Yeah, I mean, when I was listening to Sky, I was thinking about how there really are also different types of filmmakers and different types of storytellers who are motivated by different things. And so my own background is I became an activist when I was a teenager. And by the time I came to filmmaking, I was already looking for a different kind of tool to engage, but specifically in social change work. You know, I was looking to film as a way to deal with the human complexity of making change and moving people's hearts. But there are other people who come to storytelling totally differently. I meet those filmmakers all the time. Some of those people might be watching this right now. And my thought for those type of people, which is a slightly different answer, but is also like partner with people who actually care about the impact work. You know, I recently was part of a festival where I saw this filmmaker get up and speak about her film, which was so powerful, but she had no impact plan around it. And she didn't get it into show in the country where it would have the greatest impact. And I don't want to call any specific individual out, but it was so political that it didn't show at the big festivals, and she just kind of let it go. And I watched that moment and I was like, oh, she's a great storyteller. She needed to partner with an impact producer, or she needed to partner with a producer who cared about these issues enough to take it that last leg, which could be just as long as the production leg, but the impact leg, because some people don't have as much of an appetite for getting into the weeds, whether it's with policy or whether it's community work. And I know for myself, that was absolutely what motivated me. So there was no way that I was going to say, okay, it played at a couple film festivals, done now. There was no way. But for those people who are in that position where that's not your appetite, but you're working on a social issue, find some partners, find some people who want to work with you, because these are important tools. People have given so much of their lives to also be in your films and collaborate on your films, and they deserve to actually be shown strategically, not just in the places that will accept them necessarily, but the places where they can really speak to the right audience who can actually use that, you know, use that tool in a specific way. So I guess that's what I would say. I mean, in terms of my own ability to engage with sort of structural change and political change. I mean, one of the really interesting things that's coming out of my own film is there's one of the protagonists in the film who applies for German citizenship, has his citizenship denied, and is now, after watching the film on the screen, gotten motivated to start a campaign to actually intervene in the German political legal system. And what we've been doing in terms of the film team is all of the partners that we collaborated with along the way, all the people, all these advisors, we've been activating all those relationships to support him, not just around our film, but around this campaign that he's starting. So there's all kinds of unintended ways that our films will also interface with the legal, you know, the political structure. If we actually care about that structure, it may not be that we start with like, okay, I want to change this specific law, but I'm going to engage on this issue. And over the course of the years, you know, in the case of Christy's film, it was 5. In the case of my film, it was 15 years. There might be a few different pieces of legislation to either get behind or get against. We might have to pivot along the way, but really trying to think about who we know and how to activate those resources, like how, whether they're other storytellers, whether they're activists, whether they're, you know, people in the ecosystem that need to be speaking to each other, because a lot of times we're kind of straddling a lot of different spheres. If we're moving between activist spaces and media making spaces, and kind of, it's also a kind of web that we can help weave between different communities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I say something, David? I wanted to pivot off of what Christina said in terms of, you know, I would consider myself an artivist, I guess, an activist storyteller. And I knew that, you know, leading into this, like I am a climate activist, and that's why I got engaged in this story in the first place. But I also know that stories, we need strong stories in order to connect people to those actions. And so for me, my very first goal was to be able to create a story that was compelling and had emotional ties and was going to move an audience so that I could actually do the work that we wanted to do with this film. So I think it's, you know, to your question, David, of like, you know, do we come into this as activists or storytellers, and what's the connection? I think they're both incredibly linked, and they're both needed. And we had, in terms of our film, with the case still, you know, the case has now been in the courts for 6 years and has still never gone to trial. every single hearing that's been in the case has been procedural, and these young people have never had their day in court to present their evidence. And so part of what of our objective with the film was for it to be that evidence in case this case never does go to trial, that in a sense, this story is the trial. And we've been, doing a lot of work and pushing it out to our leaders. We've shared it with over 80 members of Congress. Just recently had John Kerry reach out to us asking for a screener in his preparation going to COP26. So really hoping that him watching the film will inspire him to go and speak with these world leaders, maybe thinking about the solutions in a different way. Yeah, so I agree with both Christina and Sky on it's you have to have that objective going into it.
Yeah, Christy, talk a little too about the case itself, because what's interesting is you've been working closely with the 21 plaintiffs plus the legal team. And so that's the case is called Juliana versus the United States. The film is called Youth v. Gov. The nonprofit behind Juliana is Children's Trust.
Our Children's Trust.
Our Children's Trust. So you work kind of closely with them. You were independent, but also integrated. Speak about that and how that affects an impact.
Yeah, I mean, it was really important for us to still have our independence. I mean, we don't want to be pitted as being an advocacy film for Our Children's Trust, although we are telling their story. And obviously this story and the impact work that we're doing is in support of the plaintiffs and in their ultimate quest for climate justice. So, we had to definitely, kind of, it's a hard line to figure out. First of all, you have to establish those relationships. And I think when you're working in a legal framework, you have to build that trust with the legal team that you know what you're doing and you're going to be sensitive and you're not going to do anything to jeopardize the case or jeopardize the plaintiff's standing in the case. So just even knowing like when to turn the camera off versus knowing when to turn it on was really important and just creating those relationships. But Our Children's Trust has been a great partner on the impact side of things. They've really, throughout production, gave me access to most everything that I needed. I think they understood what the power of this story would be, and I think they're very excited now to be one of our impact partners. They're going to be using this film, I think, this coming week in order to speak with young people in Utah. They're trying to recruit new plaintiffs for a case in Utah, and they're going to be using the film in that way to hopefully recruit some young people. I think it's really important to work together with the people that are the subject of your film, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they get any creative control or any control over the production, but it's a very close relationship, and I think it's a really important one.
Yeah, it is important, and I remember seeing Gasland, the Josh Fox movie at Sundance years ago, and it was so groundbreaking, a big standing ovation. And I remember a woman got up and asked a question, or it was more of a comment, said, "Why can't we all organize in all 50 states and get together and take this on?" And I, the room was on fire with this movie, and I felt it, not literally, but I feel it otherwise. As we left the room, the energy dissipated out there, and I thought about this woman who was very well-meaning and very moved by the film, and I thought, okay, surely in this audience there's X amount of people from the natural gas industry who are saying, wow, we got to worry about her and her friends. They're like, no, we're strategic people, we've well-funded, we've got all this power, we've got the best PR advice, we got all of this. And then I'm like, okay, all 50 states and earnest and well-meaning and strategic smart filmmakers trying to take that on is really daunting. I think it's just really daunting, and I admire each of you for doing that. And I want to shift a little bit for our audience for some specifics. What, and Sky, let's come back to you on this. What are some of the fundamental tenets of how you're going to, how you and your team are going to implement a impact campaign And I want to hear the same from Christy and Christina. So think about that as, what are the things that people are watching this like, okay, I need to know this and I need to write, this down.
Well, what so much has resonated here with me, like what Christy and Christina had said about good storytelling and good partners. Really, those two tenets really just, I think, are so critical to a successful impact campaign. I'll give you two quick examples. In Lifeboat, we put that film out at a moment, if you remember, it's about asylum seekers trying to cross the Mediterranean. And when we released that film, the EU was at this really critical moment where their policy was shifting away from international humanitarian law, frankly, and towards, rather tragically, right, a closing of the borders. And Christina, we could have a long conversation about this, I'm sure, and maybe we should. But because that's what was happening geopolitically at the moment, for that project, we brainstormed, because Germany as a government was on the fence. They're a leader in the EU, but they were on the fence on how they were going to address sort of this far right-wing wall of anti-immigrant sentiment, which was building up. So one of the things we did was we partnered with Service Plan, which is the second largest ad agency in Europe. And we did something called Lifeboat the Experiment, which is a completely different project, right? This after the film was out, after the film was in distribution, and sort of we brainstormed this social experiment where, in tandem with Service Plan, we took, I think it was 50 different volunteers from all facets of German society, right? And put them in a wave pool. And we didn't tell them what was going to happen beforehand. They signed all these consent releases, right? They were writers, they were journalists, they were immigrants, they were wealthy white-collar workers from all different spectrum of society, put them in this wave pool and sort of recreated what the crossing of the Mediterranean is like viscerally, what it's like to step in a raft and for X number of hours be buffeted by waves with nothing but the clothes on your back, right? So we can control the lights and smoke and wind and the waves. And then we filmed the whole thing with like 5 different cameras. And we did pre-interviews, we did post-interviews, and then we took this project and we played it in front of theaters throughout Germany, right? To try to sort of have people understand an immigrant's experience in a different way. And then played it online, so in front of major feature films, but then really had a major social media push throughout Europe throughout that summer. And we also projected part of it onto the walls of the Bundestag in Berlin as well, right? For policymakers. And we didn't make much money off of this because there was also a donation link, but we really did start a conversation within Germany, right? We really did get policymakers and the general public to start to think about immigration with empathy, right? Through a lens of empathy. And I'm such a fan of that approach. And I think that's what we can do as filmmakers that other mediums can't necessarily do as effectively. So those are just some examples of sort of the long tail of the social impact campaign from Lifeboat. We did similar things with Hunger War.
When you said wave pool, I thought I heard wrong, because I think of all the times I've talked to filmmakers, I've never heard the words wave pool used together. I was just like, that's a first. I've been doing this for a long time. But Christina, speak a little bit to the specifics of and I've been on your website and there's a lot going on with how you're expanding this narrative, utilizing this narrative. Speak to that a little bit, Christina.
Yeah, so we started the impact work really early on in the production, because at some point I realized, wow, this is going to take years and years, and there are people who are engaging with us already who want to be in conversation, and let's just start putting stuff out there. So we released a couple of short films, and we did some community screenings of the short films and said, where would these short films be most useful? And suddenly we were getting invited to do screenings and workshops, and the sort of project really organically grew out of the demands and requests we were getting to kind of go into different spaces, schools, universities, training social workers. We created a whole curriculum on anti-Roma racism, which turns out to be one of the only curriculum like it written by Roma, because we partnered with a Roma organization to write the curriculum. And it's a very substantive curriculum that's now out there in the German school system and being used in universities. So some of it came from this real, I would say, like emergent approach of, yeah, I had some ideas about what I wanted to do, but a lot of what my ideas were about being really responsive and in collaboration, not just with the creative team, but also the community that was affected by these issues. And so we created a web platform, we created these interactive immigration history timelines. But I think what I think is more important than the specific outputs, which are important, and I go to withwingsandroots.org and you can find all these resources, and feel free to be in touch with me about any of them. Is that process of actually being in engagement along the way with the people who you think the film is about and for, and not waiting until the end. And that includes the protagonists, you know, and now the protagonists are out there with me doing workshops with the film, representing the film, not just, you know, on these kind of Q&A formats, but also digging into the issues with me, with, you know, university classrooms and community groups. And I think that level of collaboration is something that, you know, isn't really encouraged by the kind of capitalist structure in the filmmaking industry. Certainly wasn't how I was trained as a student. I was trained not to show my protagonists the film until I was done, and you know, show it to them before they see it in front of a big audience, but don't let them give you any feedback. And I had a totally different approach, which wasn't to show them every cut along the way, but give them a chance along the way to see some things, because I want them to feel proud and stand up in front of this film with me and feel like it honors their stories. And they spent years of their life with me. They deserve that. So I would say some of those things for me are also the impact is them taking the film out into the world in different ways and being proud of it and standing with it, in addition to the ways that we've shown it in sort of all these different spaces. And I do think actually being a training tool, for example, for social workers, it was something I never actually had in my mind, but see, we can see how people are using our curriculum when they download it. They have to tell us what they're doing with it. And knowing that the next generation of educators, for example, is being trained with this curriculum gives me a tremendous amount of satisfaction that we're getting into spaces that really needed these resources, and we can offer them.
Yeah, I think there are all these levels. I'm just so interested in the micro and the macro. Christy, could you talk a little bit about? I'm so interested in the plaintiffs themselves, and as Christine was saying, the protagonists. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about your overall. You know, if somebody's watching this is making their film, think about their impact campaign. Christy, what would you want them to know? Where do you start? What's your fundamental mission and starting blocks? You're muted.
Sorry. I think you have to really think about what change are you trying to create, and move backwards from that goal and implement in those tactics and those tools that you will use in order to achieve that. So in our case, our goal is to hold the government accountable when it comes to the climate crisis. And so all of our strategies and tactics and tools that we've built and the impact strategy that we're working on is aimed at that goal. And I think even the way I put the story together, you know, thinking about it during production and you know, from the onset, thinking about that in mind and having that goal in terms of what I wanted the story to do and what kind of conversations I wanted the story to start. So I think, you know, if you're starting out with this and it's a new concept and you'd really like to create change with your film, like think about what change you want it to do. Do you want it to change minds? Do you want it to change behavior? Do you want it to change structures? Is it about community building? These are all different types of changes that we can create with our impact stories.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about the plaintiffs. I've met, I think, 6 or 7 of them, so only a third of the way through. But Vic Barrett was just in Telluride, who's one of the plaintiffs. You did the spin-off, which I talked about earlier. We've reached the moment about him and his own evolution and really his relationship with his father, who's a climate denier. And that was fascinating. But you also did a special sort of side screening with some folks in Telluride of Youth Speak Of with Vic in the room. Now, it was the first time because of COVID you had seen that. Talk to me a little bit about that, but also how Vic comes out of that weekend, knowing, we were texting about it or emailing that, yeah, people care about what I'm doing. And Christina spoke to that. It matters. Like, speak a little bit that with your own experience. Just
Yeah,
recently.
it absolutely matters. And unfortunately, because of COVID, I have not yet been able to do a screening with let alone all the plaintiffs together, but not even with one of them together. So, being in Telluride together with Vic was really the first time that I've been in the same room with one of the plaintiffs and watched the film. And I think it was a really powerful experience for Vic. We spoke about it on our drive back to Denver on Monday, and I think it was reinvigorating for him to see his story and his fellow plaintiff's story told, and to be in a room with people who were moved by it and had questions and were invigorated and all powered up and angry after watching the film. I think it was incredibly validating for the work that he has put his life into. Like, he's been a climate activist since he was 14. And he's 21 now. That's a huge journey for these young people, for that to be the vast majority of their childhoods, really. And I was thinking, when Christina mentioned, sharing the film with her protagonist, I had a similar experience with Julia. Julia Olsen is the lead attorney on this case, and she's really the hero. She's one of the heroes in this story who has spearheaded these climate litigations. And I can't even tell you how nervous I was to share the film with her the first time, because this is her life's work. And, it was so important to me to get the legal aspects right, and to know that I was, hitting on all the elements that they're trying so hard to get the public to understand about this case and about our constitutional rights when it comes to climate justice. And so that was also a very interesting and empowering experience for her to see the film and to see, like, these years of work that she's put into that, and to know that now there's, like, people are going to know about it, and they're getting to witness this story and feeling activated by it.
Yeah, movies have power, and when you see that, I think it has so much of that. Sky, I was really interested in what Christy said. All of you, this is so fascinating, and of course we could go on for a while, but we'll wrap in around 15 minutes. That notion of expectations, of setting a goal for yourself. Did you come in, Sky, into any of the three films with, hey, this is what we want to achieve with our impact campaign, with these real tangibles? Because I was, again, you had that terrific list earlier.
Yeah, with Hunger Ward, we want to end the war in Yemen. Right. So
it was really that big. It was just that, but were there things that you're like, okay, we want X amount of views, we want this amount of traction? Were there things that were more mundane, but also different kind of measure?
I'm looking at it right now. End war and famine is actually what it says, David.
Jeez,
so it's like, do I feel good about the film that we made and put out into the world? Absolutely. Have we achieved number one item on our strategic objectives? No. And that saddens me to say that, to admit that, but we haven't. But that's why we're still at work at it. And I go forward with hope and optimism that this film is one tool in the larger quiver of tools that our alliance needs, right, to achieve that objective. I have to believe that's true, and I do believe it's true. And, we've been told, one of the things that has warmed my heart immensely over the course of doing this social impact campaign is that so many of our partners have said to us that this is the tool that we didn't have, right? A well-told story, and there's scarcities surrounding films coming out of Yemen because it's a conflict zone, right? And it's just almost impossible to film there, even if you're in Yemen. Right, even if you're Yemeni. And so there was a scarcity issue, and continues to be a scarcity issue for well-told stories coming out of Yemen, which we're trying to solve with partners in other ways too, behind the scenes, but it has value because of that, right? So I hope when we talk in a year, David, that I can say that answer is different. Our second item, raise funds, to help slow the famine in Yemen, we are successful with, as I mentioned earlier. And that warms my heart as well, because I know for a fact we have saved lives with the film.
And that's huge. I mean, it's hard to beat that. You were nominated for Oscars with two of the films. Did that have an impact on your ability to get the word out?
No. Yes, of course it did. Yeah, no, I mean, it's
I was like, damn, that's a shame.
No, that's a wonderful piece of fortune that we've had with especially the last two films of this trilogy, is that they were recognized by the Academy and by my fellow colleagues in the Academy, and that helped us get more publicity, generate more dialogue, have more conversations, bring in influencers who could then, leverage this small little film that we made into the larger media ecosphere. And that made a difference. That helped us raise more money, right? That helped us get more influence with legislators in Washington when we approach them, because we say, hey, go to this Trevor Noah piece, watch this, listen. This is why you should pick up the phone and talk to us, right? So it's immensely helpful. And I'd be remiss not to just admit that fully. So we've been very fortunate, very lucky, and we've tried to really use that to our benefit to solve our objectives as well.
To thank the Academy.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
First off, I'd like to thank you.
Exactly right.
Christina, speak a little bit about money. Was your impact campaign, because the film itself was a long, and winding process. Was the impact campaign baked in the budget from the beginning? And I don't want to get into the number of how big the budget is, but what percentage of the impact campaign versus the budget for the film itself, if you're comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, I'll try to do it in a way that's not too depressing. I mean, it was really, really hard to raise money for the film, and it was actually easier to raise money for the impact work than for the film. So we raised as much money for the impact work, maybe more, certainly larger sums of money for the impact work. We had to do a ton of crowdfunding for the film, and so all kinds of small donations came in. But if you try to tell a story that's, complex and doesn't have celebrities and isn't shocking, sometimes it's really hard to raise money for it. So the impact work in some cases was very concrete. We were offering live events. We were offering these materials that people could use. It was a little easier for people to feel like they weren't taking a huge risk on the way they felt like with a film like mine. Oh my God, it's this huge risk. How is she going to pull these stories together? How is it going to make sense? So yeah, for us, it was sort of something we were developing in parallel, both in terms of resourcing it and finding money for it, and also in terms of doing the work, but also finding people who wanted to work on it and finding collaborators. So part of the way we just resourced the whole project is by having collaborators who wanted to give and donate their time. And it's a mixed blessing, because of course people deserve to have their time valued and resourced and their livelihood supported. And at the same time, a lot of the most powerful work that happens is people giving of themselves, and not doing it for financial reasons, but because they believe in an issue. So there was over 100 people who contributed to all of our campaign work, more than that by now. Wow. We couldn't have done it just based on money. We absolutely did quintuple the work unpaid that was paid, I would say.
And Christy, for you, the impact campaign, you said, was conceived with the film, but how did that work? Sort of the mechanics of it.
In terms of how we went about
budget and let's speak specifically to budget, because we're already and I of course you three all take the sort of low-hanging fruit approach to films. What's easy subjects, easy I'm being
right.
Totally facetious, because you guys are making films that are not only like hard subjects, but they're ambitious, following a court case, working into war zones, a multi-country, multi-character look at immigration. But speak a little specifically to the money.
Yeah, we did not have our impact budget written into our overall film production budget, and that was mostly because we had decided to work with Vulcan Productions, who was our co-production partner, same partner that Sky had for Hunger Ward. And the thinking was, I mean, I knew I wanted to work with them because they were so great about impact storytelling, and they were going to be our main impact partner in providing those in-house resources and a lot of that funding. Unfortunately, with COVID, Vulcan Productions is now closed down. They did leave the scene with providing us with some starting money for the impact budget, but we have now had to go back into that fundraising world and are currently fundraising for the impact budget, which is large. I mean, it's a two-year impact campaign that we're planning for right now. We just launched it in May. The budget is, it comes close to what the budget for the film was, but we have been able to raise a third of that so far. And we've been able to start a lot of the work that we wanted to do in terms of how we're connecting, folks with our community screenings, with folks on the ground to engage in some of those local actions and holding governments accountable. We're working with some faith-based organizations, and we'll be launching a nationwide screening in 300 congregations around the country that we're really excited about. We're getting the film into law schools around the country, as well as middle, high school, and universities. So we're, even though we haven't been able to raise all the money yet, I don't know if Sky and Christina have had these same. I mean, I know Sky wants to end the war and end famine, but we've had to kind of prioritize. If we're able to raise this bucket of money, we can do this. If we're able to raise this much more, we can do this. If we're able to raise all of it, then we can, hopefully then do some of our local state actions that we want to work specifically in 3 states where we have determined through our research that are on tipping points of really leading the country in climate actions and using the film as a tool to help with that. So the fundraising. Pardon?
You tell us which states there?
Say that again?
Which states?
Oh, which states? I think Colorado is going to be one of them.
Yeah, Colorado.
And we're looking at a couple other states and working with some of our partners to identify where we feel like the film could be most beneficial. But yeah, the impact fundraising is it's its own animal. It's its own animal. And I think once you do have a story and you have a product and a tool to work with, I think it is a little easier than fundraising for the film itself.
Yeah. David, can I just say something about that real quick?
Of course.
So I saw Christy's film at Mountain Film, and Christina, I deeply apologetic. I just got a link to your film, I think last night, so I'm gonna watch it. But when I saw your film, Christy, this quote came into my mind, which I wanted to share with you, and I didn't get a chance to. We've probably all heard it. Art disturbs and science reassures. And I think for your film, we flipped that, right? Because I think really science, right, is so disturbing in your film, right? Because when we follow the science, we understand the gravity of what's happening, right? And in this case, it's the art of your film that reassures, right? Because we see these youth, right, through your artful film, who give us hope, right? Who reassure us that there's a whole nother generation biting at the bit, right? Trying to make this change. And I meant to share that with you at Mountain Film. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance.
I love that.
But I do it now.
Thanks, I love that.
I want to talk just a little bit about how people see these films, and let me do the work of, folks, if you're watching this and want to support Christy's impact campaign for Youth v.Gov, it's a really nice way to support. Sky's work has been really clear. Christina, from here, the film, right? From here, but these are easy things to find and support, and each of these are laudable. And like I said before, we're not rivals. We're in this together in I think a really lovely way. But Sky, I know one of the films was on MTV. Christy, you're still looking for, I believe, Christina, you as well, in terms of finding a broadcaster or a streamer. So how, it's a tougher thing to motivate when you don't have the imprint of an HBO or Netflix. And so speak to that challenge. And Sky, have all the films gotten distribution?
So one of the commitments I make to participants when I start a project, and to myself, frankly, is I tell people, because they're giving you their time, right? They're collaborating with you in a deep and meaningful way. The commitment I make to the project, to myself and my collaborators, is that I will get the film into distribution as fully as I can, so that as many people in the world as possible can watch it, right? And that's sort of like the general commitment that I make to people who engage. So I've been really lucky to be able to do that with every film I've done. And what it means, though, is that I think I've gone with a different distributor with every film, almost, with some exceptions for international rights. So for this trilogy, the first one Netflix picked up, the second one, New Yorker, was North American rights, and then Al Jazeera in the Middle East, and then Bell Media in Canada, and then for Hunger Ward, it was MTV for global rights. So I keep just shopping until I find the right home.
Well, and that's, it's so critical, and I really, really hope that Youth v. Gov and From Here find the right home. Talk about social media, and especially, Christy, you've got a youth-based film. These kids are on social. I sound like the cranky old guy. Get off my lawn with your social media. But how are you utilizing that, and how is that part of an impact strategy? And I'd like to hear from that, then wrap it up with a kind of a bigger question, and say goodnight.
Yeah, the digital engagement component is pretty important for us in reaching young people in particular. So we have been working with a team on our digital engagement, and trying to kind of up the work there through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and hopefully soon we'd like to get a TikTok following going.
I'll be all over that.
We feel like that's a great way to engage young people, but I think it's hard. It's like there's pros and cons to it. Facebook is a much older generation, and they're not as interactive and engaged. Instagram seems to be a great way to work with young people, but I'm not completely convinced that it leads to actions or to change. I think it does help to drive awareness and publicity and to do all of that. And we're definitely going to keep at it, but I'm not entirely convinced yet, or we haven't found the right mechanism in terms of how we can use that really to create change. I think once we're working, locally with some of these states where we can do really targeted direct actions through social media, I think that will be a lot more useful of a tool for us.
How about you, Christina? How are you using social media within your own project?
We've used social media at various points as various people have come in who have more energy or less energy. And I guess I would just say that for most of us, we have so many hats that we're trying to wear, and social media becomes one that you're supposed to wear every single day, because to actually stay present on these platforms, you have to be active all the time. And so is it actually something you can maintain and then actually engage with, or is it something that's just gonna be a drain of resources, energetic resources? And I don't think the answer is the same for every project. I think just based on the team, the skill set, the energy, the sensibilities, people can use social media in a really dynamic way, or people can find it a total energy suck that just is about self-promotion but doesn't actually really move anything politically. So I think that all of us should be looking at our social media habits right now and just being strategic about how much we give to it, because not just on a practical level for our films, but on a personal level, we're all struggling with our attention spans and how much we can give away to all these platforms. So I'm a little bit in a critical phase right now. We've been on all Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Sometimes it's been more active. The algorithms change, and then suddenly what worked in the past doesn't work anymore, and it makes me so angry, because basically you're supposed to have a team and money to just be feeding these what are supposed to be free platforms in order for them to keep actually reaching the same audience who found you freely, but now they can't see your content because you're not paying for it to be seen, or you're not following the new rules. So I'm a little bit critical of putting too much hope in social media as our way to reach people. But I also think sometimes it works incredibly well. And if you have the right people on the team who have the energy and the skill set and the kind of vision for it, then it can be an amazing tool. So we've used it, but I don't feel like the answer is everybody has to do it, because I think a lot of people are burning out that way.
Yeah, and it is the question of attention. Yeah, and I think that's such a hard thing with hard films. Hard is the wrong word. Challenging films like you guys are making. At Original Thinkers recently, we had Luis Cejoyos there, who's made a new film called Mission Joy. And just to quickly plug that, at originalthinkers.com, it's an ideas festival. We're looking at film. And
it is amazing.
Oh, there we go. I didn't even have to plug it. Thank you, Christy. It's special, I think, what we're doing, because we're just so distilled, and we have a virtual program that's going through the month of October. I'll stop plugging my own thing. But Louis said, Louis won an Oscar for The Cove. He made Game Changers, the vegan athlete movie, Race and Extinction. And he said, he feels strongly and understandably that films can change the world. And he talked about The Cove specifically. That really talk about a challenging film. Dolphin Slaughter wins the Oscar in 2007 or 8. He said, look, the slaughter of dolphins were at this annually. They're still happening, but they're way down, and they're way down because of the movie. And so for him, he told this from our stage, and of course it makes me feel good as a filmmaker that films can change the world. I'm not going to ask you if they can change the world. And Sky, I'd like to start with you. I'd like to think about how can documentaries in particular change the world? And then we're going to wrap it up in this last question.
Well, they do. I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't believe that, and if I hadn't experienced it firsthand. I think I didn't know this when I started to make Hunger Ward, but I learned during the course of my due diligence that there was a little film right after World War II called Seeds of Destiny, which was made by this little known group within the US government, which was intended to raise awareness about children in Europe post-Hitler who were starving, right? Who were starving because of the war in Europe. And this little tiny film raised over $200 million for one of the early iterations of the UN that eventually became the World Food Program, right? To feed orphans from World War II after Hitler had fallen. And there's one example for you, right? We follow in those gigantic footsteps. And I can say, I still talk to the nurse and the doctors that are featured in Hunger Ward, and they send me pictures of the children who received treatment who wouldn't otherwise receive treatment if we hadn't raised that $235,000.
Wow.
That's saving lives.
For real. No, absolutely. Christy, talk a little bit about how can documentaries change the world?
Yeah, I absolutely, like Sky, believe that documentaries can change the world. I think that we connect with human stories. And I think the more that we understand about what other humans on the planet are going through, the more tolerant, empathic, and just that we are as a species. So I think that these stories are really crucial. I mean, I've been exposed to so many new topics and new experiences through the films that I've watched that have greatly influenced me. And I hope and I know that our films are doing that. And I think it's so important to be sharing these personal stories. The stories of climate change in particular for a long time were about the animals dying and the polar bears, and it was about the science. And I think this, the new change of telling these human stories, I think are the ones that are going to make the biggest difference, because that's, I think, what really, what we connect with, and that's what drives change and drives our motivation to create that change.
Christina, last word. How can documentaries change the world?
Thank you, David. And I just realized you are giving me an opportunity to plug our social media channels. It's all available at From Here Film. And also we are still fundraising for our impact work. We have also raised about 1/3. So thank you for the invitation that you've been creating for all of us to share ways people can connect with us. It's appreciated. I mean, I think that for me, I'm really excited about how films and storytelling can open our imagination to what is possible and can create visions that were not there before for people. And sometimes it's not about getting 1 million people to see a film. Sometimes it might be about getting the 50 right people to see the film who can do something about the issue. Sometimes it can be about showing the film to a group of people who are really activated in trying to figure out how to make change and see how to do it by seeing somebody else do it. So I think what is powerful about this medium is that it can touch hearts in a way that is pretty, I mean, we're working with sound and images and stories, and it's so emotional. We have so much power there. And how do we really use it to like create the world we want and show the world what we want? I think there's an opportunity now to tell stories about what we want in the world and lift up the voices we think need to be heard. And I'm excited about that kind of storytelling. I'm excited that there are other filmmakers who are out there doing this work with me.
We're not alone, and I'm really grateful to each of you and individually and collectively, and grateful to the Bend Film Festival for doing this, Celine and Todd and the team there. I think it's an important thing to explore. So I'm grateful for the opportunity and want to thank you guys. I also just want to close with a quote that I read in an article in the New Yorker about a book I haven't read, but I did read the article by William Bernstein in a book he wrote called The Delusions of Crowds. He wrote, quote, "Humans understand the world through narratives. However much we flatter ourselves about our individual rationality, a good story, no matter how analytically deficient, lingers in the mind, resonates emotionally, and persuades more than the most dispositive facts or data." And your films are not analytically deficient; they're analytically strong, but those stories matter, and they have real impact. And so, again, Sky, Christy, and Christina, thank you so much. From here, the trilogy of Sky and Youth v. Gov. Check out all these films, support what they're doing, and thank you all.
Thanks, David, for such a great discussion, and thanks to Bend Film Festival.
Ditto, and nice to see you, Christy and David, and wonderful to meet you, Christina.
Wonderful to meet you all.
Hey, we'll be in touch. You guys take care, everybody. That was Social Impact Filmmaking here at Bend Film Festival. Thank you all. Take care.